So, I was going to make a different video during this off week, but I figured that A, these off week podcasty videos are a good excuse to just kind of talk about other things I like beyond video games, and B, One Piece released a chapter that was so insane, and there's been a lot of discourse around it, that I just felt like I really wanted to talk about it. And, of course, throughout this entire video, there are going to be massive spoilers for chapter 1079, I believe, which is really insane to say out loud every time. Like, I know I've read all of those chapters, it's just saying it out loud really is like, man, this series is long. Okay, so the latest chapter begins with, like, 3 pages of what's going on in Egghead, which is mostly just explaining what we already know. And then the entire rest of the chapter is Kidd versus Shanks, essentially. And even that is being a little bit generous to Kidd, if we're being perfectly honest here. And so, yeah, if you're a fan of Kidd, you might not be a huge fan of this particular chapter, to say the least. And that's really where a lot of the discourse has come from, I think. There's been a lot of people, especially people that are fan of Kidd, and they've been kind of coming out as saying, like, oh my god, what happened? Like, is Shanks, like, evil? How could he possibly do something so cruel and brutal and all these other things? And it's like, I mean, let's be real here. I think that everything that was showed in this chapter is perfectly in character for who Shanks is and what we've seen of him already. And I think that this is purely just to establish Shanks' actual abilities and powers, since we've never really seen him in a real fight before. And to be fair, I think that Kidd was just simply a lot less important to the narrative as a whole. So, yeah, let's talk about the specifics of exactly what went down here. So, to back up my claim about Kidd being less important to the narrative, I mean, first of all, we're talking about Shanks here, standing next to him, who is basically more important than almost anybody you could put him next to in the story, outside of maybe the Straw Hats themselves. But on top of that, I think it's also been very clear that from the start, Oda's plan for the end of this series has featured pretty much the same small group of factions from the beginning. The Red Hair Pirates, the Straw Hat Pirates, the Blackbeard Pirates, and of course the World Government. I think that those are the main factions that are going to be the core relevant pieces in the endgame. I guess you could also include Buggy's cross-guild faction as well. That seems more like a joke faction, but I'm sure it'll play some kind of big part towards the end as well, just because of how hilarious it is. And of course, they do have Mihawk, who is obviously very important to one of the character's main dreams. And then, on top of that, the whole Worst Generation concept, Kidd, Law, Capone Beige, Bonnie, all of those characters, those were very late additions to not only the story, but also conceptually. Oda mentioned in an interview a long time ago that he came up with the Worst Generation very late into the story, like, as a concept. It wasn't something that he thought up early and then only introduced a long time later. That's why we get almost zero foreshadowing at all for anything to come with them. There's some vague stuff with how there's multiple paths in the Grand Line, which makes room for those characters to exist, but we didn't get anything explicitly about them, really. And so, as a result, I would expect that all of these Worst Generation characters, obviously outside of the ones on the Straw Hats themselves, are basically going to not be that relevant for the actual endgame of One Piece, which is probably why we're starting to see them take more of a back seat. I mean, obviously Bonnie is still being relevant to Egghead. Law is probably going to show up, given that Blackbeard's involvement and him being stated to be with him. But, like, I think they're going to be much more secondary to those main factions I already mentioned earlier. And in this case, Kidd really didn't have that much relevance to the story other than as a sort of rival for Luffy that was also kind of a dark reflection, since Kidd is a lot more brutal and mean than Luffy is, but Luffy already has that character in Blackbeard. It's just that Kidd is a lot easier to show is in more situations without it being as big of a deal, since obviously Blackbeard versus Straw Hats is going to be one of the biggest endgame fights, although it might happen sooner than we expected at this point. But apart from Kidd's actual true relevance to the grand narrative that is One Piece, a lot of the other comments that I've seen talking about this chapter are talking about how, well, maybe this confirms that Shanks is some kind of manipulator or evil or more scrupulous than we come to expect from him. Because there have been some theories that maybe Shanks is not all he's cracked up to be, and by the end of the series he might betray Luffy or, try to stop him and go for the One Piece himself or something like that. But I think that if we go back and examine all of the scenes that Shanks has been in, and fortunately there haven't been that many, so this video hopefully won't be that long, everything that Shanks does in this chapter is perfectly in character with everything we've seen up to this point, and I think that we have a very strong understanding of exactly what Shanks' motivations and moralities are at this point. All the way back in Chapter 1, and I can't believe that this is the chapter that keeps getting referenced after over 1,000 other chapters, but Chapter 1 is basically a dissertation on Shanks' character and what his philosophies and moralities are. We learn in Chapter 1 that when he confronts Higema the Bear, that mountain bandit who would insult him and pour sake all over the floor and him and just make a mess of that whole bar, because he was not threatening anybody directly and he was not putting anybody in harm's way, Shanks refused to escalate the situation, because Shanks simply does not care about things like honor or maintaining a powerful appearance or keeping his title unscathed or whatever. He does not care about any of that because all he cares about is protecting people. So as long as Higema was not escalating the situation to the point where somebody was in harm's way, then Shanks would refuse to do the same as well. Shanks essentially is a guy who will never escalate a situation. But the instant that situation did escalate, that famous scene where one of the bandits points a gun at Shanks, he does not hesitate for a second to have somebody pull their trigger and kill that mountain bandit instantly. And similarly, on that same note, when Higema then runs away and kidnaps Luffy, again, he does not hesitate to chase after him in order to save Luffy, because he cares about them and he doesn't want people getting hurt. Shanks' philosophy is about minimizing bloodshed whenever possible. Now, if we skip ahead a few hundred chapters, we get to the point where Shanks confronts Whitebeard about Blackbeard and Ace. We established throughout that chapter, and Shanks himself is even the one that really kind of explains the whole situation, that Blackbeard is a bad person. Again, like Higema, Blackbeard is a terrible person who has betrayed his own old crew members and killed people to get what he wants, and will very clearly do it again, and has no sign of stopping anytime soon. And yet, despite all that, he wants to stop Ace from hunting down Blackbeard, because he knows, either through his own wisdom and general foresight, or possibly some kind of hyper-advanced observation hockey, that if Ace were to confront Blackbeard, then that would lead to a much greater conflict, and thus have a lot more bloodshed. Now, Shanks might have tried to stop the conflict himself, but of course the problem is that Whitebeard is one of the few people that can actually stand up to Shanks, so he knew that all he could really do is talk to him and try to convince him otherwise. And I'm sure that if it wasn't for the fact that this is Whitebeard we were talking about, Shanks probably would have tried to go stop that conflict himself. But if he had, then Whitebeard would have probably come in to interfere directly, and then we would have gotten a war anyways. So, unfortunately, Shanks, despite all of his best efforts, was unable to prevent Marineford from happening, but at least we see that just like his philosophy would dictate, he did everything in his power to try and stop Marineford from happening. And then, of course, when we then move ahead again and actually get to Marineford, he, first of all, stops Kaido from interfering, because all Kaido cares about is having a giant war and tons of needless bloodshed. So, of course, he does everything in his power to stop Kaido from showing up at Marineford so that we don't get even more deaths on the table. Then he allows Marineford to continue because, again, there's no way he can personally stop Whitebeard. And then once Whitebeard is down and Ace is killed and the war is effectively over, that's when he steps in to effectively put an end to the fighting, because now there is no longer any valid reason to continue fighting. And again, Shanks' philosophy is all about minimizing bloodshed. He does not like it when people are put in harm's way, especially for no reason. So he finally then shows up to Marineford and says, hey, if you want to continue fighting, then we're going to be your opponents, regardless of whether you're a Marine or a pirate. And that way he puts an end to the fighting so that people can go home and no more people have to actually die. And so now we get to the current chapter, where Shanks once again acts and gets into a conflict with Kidd. And we know Kidd is not a great person. The main reason why he had a bounty that was bigger than Luffy's when we first met him is because he was explicitly a lot more brutal and willing to kill people in order to accomplish his own goals. And we reestablished that in this chapter with Shanks literally just reading a dossier on Kidd's history of where he came from and what kinds of insane, savage things he's done to get to this point. And even then, we still get him showing some level of concern for Kidd, where he talks about, like, oh, hey, has Kidd had enough time to heal since Wano? It's not really been that long. And Yasop reassures him, like, oh, yeah, well, he's clearly on his feet and he's clearly up for a fight. So Shanks is like, oh, okay, I guess that's all right then to maybe talk about this. And I'm sure that if Kidd was more injured, that Shanks probably would not have been willing to go so hard on him. But then, it's only when Kidd explicitly threatens a bunch of innocent people, just like before in these other situations, then all of a sudden, Shanks gets hyper serious, and that's when he attacks. Everything that Shanks does in this chapter lines up absolutely perfectly with everything we have established about his character up to this point. He uses observation haki to witness Kidd's attack, fortunately before it could actually happen, and we literally see that Kidd is going to kill potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent people who are part of Shanks' Grand Fleet, just to get, like, not even because he hates those people, but just because he has a vendetta against Shanks, and killing those people will probably get his attention. And, well, to be fair, it certainly did. Now, of course, even then, some people have been saying that Shanks' reaction is still too much of an overreaction compared to other things, and that Kidd should have gotten, less brutal of a punishment for his actions. Though, again, Kidd was going to almost certainly kill all of those people for no reason, and that is directly against Shanks' philosophy. So of course Shanks is going to 100% hate that. And while sure, Shanks could have probably just kicked the cannon away and deflected the beam or something and basically nullified the attack without actually hurting Kidd, at the end of the day, any kind of proactive, extended conflict between the two people would almost certainly result in way more bloodshed than would be absolutely necessary. And again, Shanks is all about minimizing bloodshed. So when it comes to minimizing bloodshed, the easiest way to do that in a conflict is to kill your opponent as quickly as possible. Having some kind of extended conflict where Kidd could have a chance to fire off more giant destructive laser beams, potentially creating tons of collateral damage across all the various crews and ships that Shanks has promised to protect, that it's just putting more lives in danger than is absolutely necessary. And so Shanks' philosophy dictates that he must take out Kidd as quickly as possible. But then, of course, the other thing that people talk about as a big overreaction is what happens after he takes out Kidd. Because he takes out Kidd and Killer in a single attack, which is part of why I think it's a bit generous to say that the whole chapter was about their fight. It was really only about 2 pages. But even then, so he takes out Kidd and Killer, and the rest of the crew immediately surrender, which is 100% fair. And then they hand over their road poneglyphs, but then Dory and Bragi unleash their Hakoko sovereignty attack and just 100% obliterate the entire ship and send the entire crew down into the ocean. And you might think, well, they already surrendered. Like, this is clearly like, this can't be a good thing for Shanks to do. But again, this is exactly like in Chapter 1. As soon as somebody points a gun at him, that's when one of his crew points a gun back and pulls the trigger. And just like what Dory and Broggy say in this chapter, if you're gonna point a cannon at someone, you better be ready for when they fire back. Shanks has zero mercy once you're willing to put a life in danger. At that point, the conflict has started, and it ends when he decides it has ended. So just because they surrendered does not necessarily mean that they are innocent. Because, to be fair, they are part of Kidd's crew. Kidd is a brutal, ruthless captain who is willing to kill people needlessly. So, while sure, he probably is pretty bad, but he's not exactly a slaver. Everybody on his crew is almost certainly there willingly, which means that they are implicitly agreeing with whatever Kidd is doing. So all of those people, in Shanks' eyes at least, even if they are actively surrendering, they're still okay with the fact that Kidd was going to kill all of those innocent people for no reason. And again, that is 100% inexcusable by Shanks' standards. Now, to be fair, the chapter only just came out, and we don't know the full ramifications and outcome of this conflict. Kidd might not actually be dead, and I'm sure at least some of his crew might survive. Now, to be fair, the chapter does say that the entire crew was completely eradicated, but that could just mean that, like, they will never sail under that flag again. Like, these people are abandoning ship, and they will never reconvene. But I would not be surprised if someone like Killer survives and, like, meets up with the Straw Hats to explain what happened, or something like that. But in general, yeah, I think that Kidd's story has come to a fairly decisive and conclusive end. And to be frank, I think that he was long overdue for some kind of comeuppance like this. Like I said, he was very explicitly not a good person. He was very much an evil pirate, like I said, akin to Blackbeard, where he was a ambitious pirate like Luffy, but he was willing to kill and put people in harm's way completely needlessly just to do whatever he wanted to do. And Oda clearly is not a fan of people like that, given literally the entire story of One Piece. So it was only a matter of time before he was given some kind of comeuppance like this. And yeah, maybe it seems a bit disrespectful to just take him out in basically one shot and then obliterate his crew, but that is a defining character trait of Shanks, and I think that it is perfectly consistent and reasonable to showcase Shanks' power like that by destroying Kidd so quickly. And it may seem like this also makes Shanks just leaps and bounds more powerful than the other Yonko, given, Kidd did put up a good fight against Big Mom, even if Law was helping out. Like, he's still up there in the power hierarchy, and like I said, he was a rival to pre-Gear 5 Luffy. So, like, he's obviously powerful, but you gotta keep in mind that the other Yonko that we've been seeing so far, notably Big Mom and Kaido, like, they mess around a lot. Like, Big Mom is frankly not all there all the time, and she clearly is, she messes around with all of her homies and her weird powers and everything, and she's easily distracted by food, and she just seems to not really take many things seriously. And of course, like I said, he was getting direct help from Law, who definitely carried his own weight in that fight. And Kaido beat his ass, no problem, early on, and then it was basically Luffy who did most of the work in that fight. And even then, Kaido really doesn't have any kind of sense of self-preservation, and he lives for the fight itself. So even his fight with Luffy went on a lot longer than it probably would have if all Kaido cared about was defeating his enemies. But that's not what he cares about. He cares about having a good fight and earning a good death. Shanks, meanwhile, he, as I've already talked about numerous times, he is not willing to waste any amount of time if it means saving the lives of people he cares about. That is his first and last goal in any fight that he involves himself in, and so it is only natural that he will end that fight as quickly as possible. If Kidd had not threatened all of those people, maybe they would have gotten a little bit better of a fight, and Shanks would have gone a little bit more easy on him, and they could have had a little bit more of a back and forth. But the instant he put all those lives in danger, Shanks was going to end that fight in 10 seconds flat, and I think that makes sense. So yeah, I think that this is going to do it for this latest sort of podcasty episode about the latest One Piece chapter. If you want to continue the discussion in the comments, feel free. I'm happy to talk about One Piece anytime. And if you like the video, feel free to give it a like. And if you want to see me make more videos like this in the future, feel free to give me a subscribe. And I'll see you guys next time.